There's a fault line off the coast of the Pacific Northwest that most of the country has never thought about, and right now it's doing something that made the people who watch it for a living sit up and pay closer attention than they have in months. We're talking about a jump in seismic tremor along the Cascadia subduction zone. Let's start with the number that kicked this off. A public tracker that monitors tremor activity along Cascadia showed a count of roughly 382 tremor epicenters, up from about 307 just 10 days earlier. That's a jump of around 75 in a week and a half, and it's the second noticeable spike this month. Now, before your brain jumps to worst-case territory, I want to slow down and tell you exactly what that number is. And this is crucial because the precision truly matters. This isn't 382 earthquakes that struck in one night. It's a rolling, cumulative count of tremor epicenters detected across a moving window of time by a network of seismic instruments planted along the fault. So the honest way to describe it is, the fault has been noticeably more active over the last week and a half than it was before, and the character of that activity has changed in a way that matters more than the raw count does. Here's the part that actually caught seismologists' attention. 10 days earlier, the tremor was spread out across almost the entire length of the fault, from the waters off Vancouver Island all the way down to Northern California. Now most of the new activity has packed itself into one specific stretch, the southern end, off Northern California and Southern Oregon, with only scattered signals up north. In other words, the count went up and the map got tighter. That reorganization is the real story here. And to understand why, you need to understand three things: what tremor actually is, what kind of fault we're dealing with, and why the location of this cluster is the detail that changes the tone of the whole conversation. So what is tremor exactly? It is not an earthquake you would feel. It's a faint, low-frequency rumble generated tens of miles beneath the surface, where two tectonic plates are sliding past each other slowly and quietly, instead of locking up and snapping. Scientists call this episodic tremor and slip. Over the course of days or weeks, the deep portion of the fault creeps forward by just a few millimeters. Over the course of days or weeks, the deep portion of the fault creeps forward by just a few millimeters. We only know it's happening because instruments sensitive enough to hear the fault whispering have been listening for it. That ability to listen is surprisingly new. For most of the history of seismology, scientists assumed the deep part of a subduction zone just slid smoothly and silently, generating nothing worth measuring. Then, in the early 2000s, researchers in Japan and in the Pacific Northwest picked up on a strange rhythmic signal that didn't behave like a normal earthquake, paired with tiny ground deformations that instruments could detect but humans could never feel. That's when they realized the deep fault was slipping in slow motion, on a semi-regular cycle, and that tremor was the sound of it happening. Cascadia turned out to be one of the best natural laboratories on Earth for studying this phenomenon, which is exactly why there's a public tracker counting these signals in real time. We've only had this window into the fault's inner workings for about 2 decades, a blink of an eye in geological terms. Now here's why that whisper actually matters to you. The dangerous section sits higher up, much closer to the coastline. A shallow zone where the two plates are jammed together so tightly they haven't budged in over 3 centuries. That locked zone is essentially welded shut by friction, and every year, as the plates continue converging at roughly 40 millimeters, the motion that can't happen at the locked zone gets stored instead, like a spring being wound tighter and tighter with nowhere to release. When the deep fault slips and produces tremor, 2 things happen simultaneously, and this is the detail that keeps researchers up at night. It releases a bit of stress in the deep zone, which sounds like good news, but that very same slip nudges a small amount of additional load onto the shallow locked zone directly above it, the exact patch of the fault that would eventually produce a magnitude 9 earthquake. So tremor isn't the earthquake, it's the sound of the machine that loads the earthquake, running right now. To understand why the southern location makes this more interesting, you need a quick geography lesson. Cascadia runs about 1,000 kilometers, roughly 600 miles, from Northern California up past the middle of Vancouver Island. Along that stretch, several oceanic plates are diving underneath North America at different rates and in different ways. The smaller Gorda plate handles the southern end, the larger Juan de Fuca plate covers the middle, and a fragmenting sliver called the Explorer plate sits at the far north. The smaller Gorda plate handles the southern end, The larger Juan de Fuca plate covers the middle, and a fragmenting sliver called the Explorer plate sits at the far north. 3 separate forces converge there at once, the Gorda plate itself being shoved underneath the continent. 3 separate forces converge there at once, the Gorda plate itself being shoved underneath the continent, an undersea spreading ridge pushing on it from the west, and a sideways sliding boundary called the Blanco fracture zone grinding against it from yet another angle. Stress arrives from multiple directions simultaneously, which is why moderate offshore earthquakes are simply a normal regular occurrence down there, even in an unremarkable year. Adding to that, the Gorda plate isn't a clean rigid slab. It's small, relatively warm, and it deforms internally, cracking and bending under pressure from all sides rather than sliding through as one solid piece. That internal fracturing produces its own separate earthquakes, distinct from the main plate boundary, and untangling which quakes come from inside the deforming plate versus the locked boundary itself is a constant challenge for the scientists watching this region. And untangling which quakes come from inside the deforming plate versus the locked boundary itself is a constant challenge for the scientists watching this region. The day before the tremor count was reported, a magnitude 4.2 earthquake struck offshore in that same southern region, following a couple of smaller shocks earlier that day. On its own, a 4.2 out there is nothing unusual. But paired with a tremor count that just concentrated in the same spot, it reads as one more piece of a broader pattern, stress working its way through the southern end of the fault. Now let's talk about why the south specifically deserves extra attention, and this comes straight from the fault's own history. The southern segment of Cascadia doesn't wait nearly as long between major earthquakes as the northern segment does. Its average repeat interval sits around 240 years, compared to roughly 500 years for a rupture of the entire fault at once. By that measure, the south simply breaks more often, and right now, it's statistically closer to its average interval than any other stretch of the margin. Researchers who study this specific segment estimate it's capable of producing an earthquake up to around magnitude 8.3 all on its own, without the rest of the fault joining in, and they put the odds of that happening sometime in the next 50 years at somewhere between 37 and 43%. Sit with that for a second. That's better than a 1 in 3 chance of a magnitude 8 class earthquake hitting Northern California and Southern Oregon within most of our lifetimes. That figure comes from paleoseismic research published back in 2012, and it has held up well since. It's worth knowing where numbers like that actually come from, because they aren't guesses pulled from thin air. When a great earthquake ruptures offshore, it shakes loose underwater landslides that send layers of sediment cascading down the continental slope, and those layers get preserved on the seafloor. Pull up a long sediment core, and you're essentially reading a muddy calendar of past earthquakes, 1 layer per event, and those layers get preserved on the seafloor. Pull up a long sediment core, and you're essentially reading a muddy calendar of past earthquakes, 1 layer per event. Scientists at Oregon State University spent years extracting and reading cores like these up and down the margin. In fact, the southern segment has already passed roughly 85% of its own historical repeat intervals, meaning most of its past gaps between earthquakes were shorter than the one we're currently sitting in. So when a tremor spike shows up and then concentrates itself in the south, it's spotlighting the one part of the fault that already had the shortest fuse and the highest near-term odds. That's the honest, sober takeaway from the current reading. The more probable near-term scenario isn't the full-length magnitude 9 that dominates headlines. It's a partial rupture confined to the southern segment in the magnitude 8 range. The full margin event is still absolutely possible, and it would be far worse, but right now, the odds are leaning south. A rising tremor count does not predict when an earthquake will happen. Nowhere on Earth has that ever worked. There is no validated formula that converts a tremor count into a date, a month, or even a year. Tremor along Cascadia actually recurs on a fairly regular cycle, roughly every 14 months beneath the northern part of the system, and on different intervals elsewhere. And the overwhelming majority of these episodes are followed by absolutely nothing. That regularity is itself an important clue. Because these episodes happen on a rough schedule already, a rising count is often just the fault going through one of its completely normal cycles, playing out over a few weeks, and then settling back down. We've only been watching this closely for about 20 years, which is nothing compared to the roughly 3-century rhythm of the truly massive earthquakes. So a number that looks alarming today might simply turn out to be ordinary once we've watched the fault complete many more of these cycles. Think of tremor less like an alarm clock and more like a gauge on the side of a machine. It tells you the engine is running, and roughly how hard, and where the load is currently being applied. What it absolutely cannot tell you is the exact moment the locked zone will finally give way, because that depends on the strength of a patch of rock miles beneath the ocean that we can't directly measure. The gauge is real, the reading is elevated, and the load is landing on the least forgiving segment, but the gauge still doesn't tell time. So if anyone tells you this tremor spike means a major quake is days or weeks away, that's not supported by the science. And if anyone tells you it means absolutely nothing, and you should ignore it entirely, that's just as wrong. Cascadia doesn't hand out simple answers, and there's actually a genuine scientific disagreement buried in here that explains why smart researchers can look at the exact same data and land on opposite conclusions. Frequent tremor from the deep fault can honestly be read two different ways, and both interpretations are defensible with current evidence. One view says this is a pressure release valve. Every time the deep zone slips a little, it vents stress that might otherwise accumulate, which would mean more tremor is simply the fault breathing normally. The opposing view says that same slip doesn't relieve stress from the locked zone above. It delivers stress to it, tightening the spring a little more with every episode. And here's the uncomfortable part. Surface instruments alone can't currently tell us which interpretation is correct. We're watching one signal that could mean two contradictory things, and the tools to resolve that ambiguity from underwater don't fully exist yet, though networks of seafloor sensors positioned directly above the fault are slowly being expanded to measure strain on the shallow zone directly, instead of inferring it from land-based stations hundreds of miles away. Until that technology matures, this question stays genuinely open. To understand what's actually at stake here, it helps to go back to the last time this fault let go completely. On the night of January 26, 1700, the entire length of Cascadia ruptured at once in an earthquake now estimated at magnitude 9.0. The two plates lurched an average of about 19 meters, more than 60 feet, along roughly 1,000 kilometers of fault. We know the exact date thanks to one of the more remarkable detective stories in Earth science. That earthquake sent a tsunami racing across the entire Pacific Ocean, and it struck the coast of Japan roughly 9 to 10 hours later, where local records described a wave arriving with no earthquake to explain it. Centuries afterward, scientists matched those Japanese written records to drowned groves of dead cedar and spruce trees along the Pacific Northwest coastline. Forests that had been killed instantly when the land dropped during the quake. Tree ring dating and indigenous oral histories filled in the rest of the picture. An unexplained tsunami on one side of the ocean and a mysterious dead forest on the other turned out to be two halves of the very same night. That's the kind of event this fault is capable of producing, and it's the benchmark against which the current tremor activity is being measured. 326 years have now passed since that night, and here's where the word overdue needs to be handled carefully, because it does a lot of misleading work in casual conversation. Looking back roughly 6,000 years, only about 2 gaps between major Cascadia earthquakes lasted longer than the span we're currently in. Stretch the window to 10,000 years, and only 8 out of 41 intervals ran longer. We are by any measure sitting in unusually long territory. But overdue implies a clock ticking on a fixed schedule, and the actual paleoseismic record doesn't behave that way. The gaps between earthquakes are irregular, and some researchers argue the pattern looks closer to random than to clockwork, which would make overdue a genuinely misleading term. Other scientists, reading the same sediment layers, argue the southern segment specifically is running hot and is closer to failure than the averages suggest. Both of these are honest interpretations of the same data. What isn't up for debate is the one number nobody disputes. The plates are still converging at that same 40 millimeters per year. The shallow zone is still completely locked, and strain has been building in that patch of rock every single year for over 3 centuries with nowhere to go. Now let's talk about scale, because this is what makes Cascadia different from almost any other seismic hazard in the country. A full-length magnitude 9 rupture wouldn't shake for a few seconds, Models suggest 4 to 6 minutes of continuous shaking. That duration comes directly from the size of the rupture itself. As the break races along 1,000 kilometers of fault, every section keeps radiating energy the entire time, so the ground doesn't jolt once and stop. It keeps rolling for as long as it takes the rupture to travel the full length of the margin. Buildings that could easily survive 15 seconds of shaking would instead have to survive several minutes of it. The tsunami would follow almost immediately, with the first waves reaching the outer coast in as little as 15 to 30 minutes, nowhere near enough time to drive to safety, which is exactly why coastal residents are told to move on foot to higher ground the moment shaking stops. Some exposed stretches of coastline could see waves running up several dozen feet, and during the earthquake itself, long sections of the coast could drop 3 to 6 feet almost instantly, sinking the land right as the water arrives. Federal planning scenarios have long estimated on the order of 14,000 deaths across Oregon and Washington from a full rupture, though more recent state-level analysis argues that figure understates the risk, with some estimates reaching closer to 25,000 fatalities, tens of thousands more injured, and economic losses well above $30 billion. If coastal evacuations were delayed by even 10 minutes, on the order of 1 million people could end up displaced, and water, power, and roads west of the interstate corridor could remain down for weeks or even months. That's the full margin scenario, the low probability, high consequence event that gets all the headlines. But the scenario the current tremor activity is actually pointing towards is the smaller one, and I want to stress that smaller is relative here. A partial rupture confined to the southern segment in the magnitude 8 range wouldn't level the entire Pacific Northwest, but it would be devastating for Northern California and Southern Oregon specifically. Its own tsunami, its own violent shaking, and days to weeks of severed roads, power, and water for the communities closest to that segment. And based on the odds we just walked through, this is actually the more probable near-term Cascadia earthquake, exactly the outcome that a concentrated southern tremor cluster and a companion magnitude 4.2 quake are most consistent with. So let's bring it back to where we started, a tremor count climbing to 382 and then concentrating itself in the southern segment is not a prediction that the South is about to rupture. It's a readout, a real-time gauge, showing that the part of the fault with the shortest fuse and the highest long-term odds is currently the one absorbing new stress. That's exactly why this reading deserves your attention, rather than your panic. The right response was never fear. It's the boring, unglamorous stuff that actually saves lives. Know your evacuation route to higher ground if you live along that coastline. Put together a real household emergency plan, and keep enough supplies on hand to get through several days without power, water, or open roads. That last point matters more than it sounds, because the communities along the Northern California and Southern Oregon coast tend to be smaller, more spread out, and less resourced than the bigger cities to the north. Fewer hospitals, longer roads, more bridges that a magnitude 8 could take out in seconds. An earthquake the rest of the country might treat as a brief regional headline could leave those towns genuinely isolated for days before outside help arrives. Going forward, the next few tracker readings are what will actually settle the immediate question. If southern tremor keeps intensifying and starts migrating upward toward the locked zone, that's the pattern seismologists will be watching most closely. If it settles back down as this episode runs its natural course, then this was simply another cycle of the machine doing exactly what it's always done. Either way, we'll know more within weeks, not years, because these instruments are updating continuously. It's also worth keeping an eye on the far north, where tremor has started registering again off Vancouver Island, the same general area where a magnitude 5.6 struck less than a week earlier. That one turned out to be a sideways sliding quake inside a different fragmenting plate, rather than the main megathrust. so it isn't a sign the locked zone up there is failing. But whether new activity in that area eventually migrates toward the main fault boundary is exactly the kind of detail that could shift the northern outlook. Here's the honest bottom line. For the first time in human history, we can watch, almost in real time, the machine that loads the most dangerous fault in North America. We can count the tremors, map where they cluster, and measure the strain that's been quietly accumulating since 1700. And the better our instruments become, the more precisely we can describe a fault that we still, fundamentally, cannot schedule. This rising count isn't the fault announcing its arrival, it's the fault breathing. And from the breathing alone, we still can't say for certain whether it's resting or getting ready. We'll be watching the next readings closely, and the moment anything changes, you'll be the first to know.